The Big H Podcast, tune in now. Conversations that'll wow. Laugh and learn, stay a while. Let's explore that Hilton style. From the highs to the lows, every story just explodes. Mike's got questions on the go, diving deep from head to toe. Every week the guests align, sharing moments so divine. Stay with us, the pace is fine. Every episode you'll find. The Big H Podcast, tune in now. Conversations that'll wow. Laugh and learn, stay a while. Let's explore that Hilton style.
Check one, check one, checked one.
Now, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, a little louder.
Check one, check two, check two.
Yep. Good evening. My name is Mike Heiss, and I'm here with Conversations with Crumb. It's our initial podcast with Village of Hilton historian, Mr. Dave Crumb. And we hope that from future on, we're going to bring lots of moments of Hilton history through the voice of Dave Crumb. Dave, it's great to have you here. For our first-time listeners and for those of you that have been listening to you for years, why don't you introduce yourself, a little bit of your background, your education, and how you became so interested in history?
Okay, well, thanks, Mike. It's nice to be here. And, well, to get started, I was born in Hilton, or actually in Rochester, but I grew up in Hilton, right in the village of Hilton for my first 8 years. Right at the corner of Lake Avenue and Main Street. And that's kind of where all the action was back in those days. And we went to the Baptist church, and I was a curious kid, and I asked a lot of questions, and people probably were a little irritated with so many questions, but I did get answers, and some of them I remember, but I can reflect back on the Hilton from the mid-1940s to 1960. In 1960, I left town abruptly, and I went to Florida to college, later to Michigan to college, and then my career in Michigan in the restaurant industry, and then later in the hotel industry in Indiana. Wherever I went and traveled, I was fascinated with the local history of the area, and I always dug in, although it was very different than Hilton. In some cases, for instance, in Michigan, I was in Marshall, Michigan, and I found that many New York staters had migrated to Michigan back in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. And they'd named their towns in Michigan very similar to our towns and villages here in, in Western New York. For instance, there's an Albion, Michigan, a Parma, Michigan, also Parma, Ohio. There's even a Manitou Beach, Michigan, which I thought was amazing, and many other similar towns. I met a lady, actually I took a room in her rooming house when I first got there, and her name was Ethel Markham, and she said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "I'm from Hilton, New York." And she said, "Oh my gosh, my great-grandfather came from North Greece. And there was a Markham farm still there back in the 60s. And this lady's family had come from there. So that was kind of interesting. So anyway, moving on, I've lived in a lot of different places, Indiana, Michigan, Boston, Florida. Around 1981, I guess it was, I was transferred back to Rochester to run the Greece Marriott. And that time I was able to purchase our family farm where I still reside. And so I jumped back into local history as just a side hobby. And one thing led to another. And around 2008, I guess it was, Mary Townsend, who'd been our historian for about 18 years, taking over from Leith Wright, who'd been a historian for 30 years. Mary wanted to retire, and she was looking for a replacement. I threw in my application, and the village board appointed me, and I've been here ever since. And I'm also the town of Parma historian as well, pretty much similar material. So the thing I like about this history business is that you learn something new every day. You learn something old every day, perhaps, or something integral to something that you've been looking for. It's never boring. It's always a lot of fun. We meet lots of interesting people. You never know what's coming around the corner, and I choose my own hours. So that kind of brings me up to date, and so I think that's enough of my background.
Well, I don't know. You said some interesting things that I wasn't aware of. I didn't know that you lived in Indiana, Michigan, and that you were in the hotel business and everything. Doing those type of jobs, those occupations, did you ever anticipate that you'd have this rich interest in history and that you'd be taking over the village of Hilton and their historical memorabilia?
Well, I didn't know I would, but I would come in here after I moved back to Rochester, and Leith Wright was always in touch with my folks to borrow family pictures and things, and then she was writing books. And as early as the Sesquicentennial back in 1959, what was I, about 15 or 16. Shirley Houston wrote a book, and so did Elizabeth Keller, who was the village historian at the time. And I participated in the writing of both those books, not writing anything, but loaning pictures, finding things for them, talking to them. And both of them gave me credits at that time, which I didn't think much about at the time. But looking back, I'm thinking, gee, I really was involved at that point. And so I'm not surprised that I got into this. A lot of people think, who'd want to do this kind of a job? I could say anybody who's interested in history in retirement. I wouldn't want to try to tackle it while I was in the hotel business. We were working 24/7, and it was a crazy, fun business, but no time for history. Though I did make or I don't want to say I made some history. I met a lot of interesting people in the hotel business, such as Elvis Presley and Bob Hope and Vincent Price, Sonny and Cher, when they were a couple, were there. And back in those days, they loved to have you take your picture with them and so forth. So I have pictures from those times, and so that, looking back, is kind of fun. It happened so fast I didn't think too much about it, but now reflecting, it was a special time.
Well, I can already tell in our first 5 minutes here that we have enough topics for future podcasts just to delve into the initial history that you've had. A lot of that stuff I wasn't aware of, and I know listeners would be really, really super interested in all that background that you have. You're quite a humble man. The few times that I've met you, you don't like to speak about yourself. You like to speak about the history of Hilton. And when we got together and talked about doing these podcasts, you had recommended some topics that you would like to hit on and focus in on the village of Hilton. And one of the ones that we wanted to start off with was the Underground Railroad.
Yeah, I think that's a good starting place because everybody's sort of interested in that. It's very current in today's news. I just found an article in the Rochester Democrat from a couple of weeks ago, not about Parma, but Binghamton Trail to honor Harriet Tubman, anti-slavery leaders. And they're putting up a historical marker down there. So it's an interesting article. I'm going to file it in our Underground Railroad file. But here in Parma, there were a lot of abolitionists. An abolitionist was a person committed to abolishing slavery as it stood. It's a very complicated topic. I'll try to make it as cogent as possible. First of all, to participate in the Underground Railroad was totally against the law. You were breaking the law. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, I believe, took place, and at that time they made it a federal crime to participate in aiding and abetting escaping slaves trying to get to Canada. And So not everybody was inclined to participate. A lot of people believed that it was a bad thing and kind of wanted to, but their better judgment said no. But there were people that said, this is so bad, we're going to do what we have to do to aid and abet the fugitives coming through. And there were quite a number of people in Parma. Now, these aren't necessarily documented by legal, like census records or anything like that. It came down in folklore, and that's our documentation. But in 1865, after the Civil War, people were pretty burned out. They were pretty sad. Many people had lost children, sons and brothers, and so forth in the war. It was a very dark and dreary and sad time. A lot of people wearing black. Things were quiet. Not a lot of talk about the Underground Railroad. But following the Civil War in the 1870s, there was a lot of prosperity, and that continued into the 1880s. And then people, the old timers, began to talk. And they'd say, yeah, we hit some fugitives in our basement, and so-and-so took them over to Charlotte to get them on a Canadian ship, and interesting stories. And I knew some of these old timers as a kid, and they would talk about it, and other people heard the same stories, and it became agreed upon that these things were accurate. So we have houses in the town of Parma and in the village of Hilton that were considered safe houses, where the owners broke the law and they would hide a fugitive in the basement, out in the barn, up in the attic, anywhere that there was a cubby hole. And this Underground Railroad was not what young children like to think of it as a tunnel going under the country where trains were running back and forth. No, it was an underground system against the law. But people who were in this network and in this league were abolitionists, many Methodists and Baptists, and just citizens all over New York State, all over Ohio, some even in the South, that were trusted. And the fugitives could, people like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, who were some of our Rochester icons. Harriet Tubman was in Auburn, but Frederick Douglass is probably one of our most famous African Americans in the country, and he lived in Rochester, and he wrote the newspaper called the North Star. And Parma's not far away. Greece, Hamlin, all the towns along the lake were especially involved, because once you got to the lake, you had a way to get to Canada, and once you were in Canada, you were free. So back to Parma. One of our most documented stops is the Chase Flack Wyatt cobblestone house on Manitou Road, which is just opposite Ladder Road. And that house was owned by Isaac Chase and his wife, and they were committed abolitionists. And Isaac Chase, believe it or not, was the supervisor of the town of Parma at one time. But he took a leadership role. And another stop was the old Chauncey Knox General Store at Parma Center, which many people, older people today might remember as Liqueurs or Zellwegers. Had many different owners, but Chauncey Knox built that store in 1834, and the Underground Railroad and all this business was going on in the 1840s and 50s. And that was a stop that everybody agrees on. There was talk that there was a tunnel that went from the store to across the street. There have been people that have said they saw the remains of the tunnel. I never have, but this tunnel was in case people came into the store and wanted to check for any fugitives. You had to say, well, sure, go ahead and look around. Well, somebody could knock on the floorboards and they'd go through the tunnel and get out and go into the next place. Things like that were happening. Chauncey Knox's son-in-law was Rodney Putnam Odell, and his brother had a store in Charlotte. At night, it's reputed that they would take the fugitives under a load of hay across Ladder Road down to the village of Charlotte on the waterfront. And then they'd take them out to a waiting Canadian ship and sail them away under the moonlight. So this is how it all worked. More stories about that exist in Parma. There's one story by Charles Effner and I believe Gilbert Childs. They were a couple of young men back in the 1840s, and they got involved with an escaped slave, and somehow they concealed him in a wagon and got him up on the Ridge Road, and they got in a wagon and got him down to Lewiston and across the river. There's more detail to that. I'd have to get it out and read it to you, but there's lots of things, and there are things popping up all the time. We had a speaker last year at our Historical Society banquet. The material was great, but the slides were not good. But his material was all about the Abolition Society, the Anti-Slavery Society in Western New York. And he told me that there were 140 members on a list that came from the town of Parma. I've yet to find that list, but that's something that's in my head to try to locate one of these days, because that would be quite a breakthrough, and to find out who those participants were. Trying to think of other Underground Railroad stories in Parma. The Gideon Archer home on top of South Hill has a historic marker in front of it. That was the first residence in the town of Parma, not that house, but there was a log cabin there first. And that was owned by Jonathan Underwood, our first settler. In 1845, he sold his 100-acre farm, which traveled all the way down South Hill to Salmon Creek. And it was a 100-acre parcel on Lot 1, Range 5. Well, Gideon Archer came in 1845, and he built the house that still stands up there. It's a Greek Revival style small farmhouse. And it was reputed that he also concealed slaves there in that house. And there are probably another dozen houses around the town of Parma that have claims that they hid slaves. One quick story that comes to mind was the Twentyman family. They lived at Parma Center. They lived in a house that's still standing there right on the northeast corner next to the transmission shop. Mr. Twentyman was an undertaker, mortician back in the day, and he had a coffin shop out behind his house, which is no longer there. And apparently there was a tunnel from another general store that's no longer standing that went from the general store back into the coffin house. And they say they used to hide the fugitives in the caskets. And then they would ship them away and somehow do that. But that's a story that's been passed along for 100 years. The Twentymans told it. I first heard it back in the 1950s. Shirley Houston has written about it. Just lots and lots of interesting things. It's great discussion. One last parting note that I'll add is that we are going to honor one of the participants in the underground, whom I've not mentioned at the moment. His name is Walter Vond. And our first African-American family in Parma, on record, was the Vond family. Walter's father was Nero Vond, who had been a slave. He came from Vermont, according to the census. We don't know anything about his past, and nor do his Vond descendants know anything, but we do know where they lived on North Avenue. It's the location where the Edward Misma House once stood. The house burned down in the 1960s. A new house has been built at the location. But Walter was one of 6 sons And I think there was one daughter of Nero and Mary Vond. And he stayed with his mother and sister throughout his life. He never married. But during the 1840s and 50s, he did participate in the underground. And so the story goes like this. Nero Vond and Mary arrived in Hilton about 1837. They settled down by Braddock Bay. Didn't work out because there were a lot of mosquitoes down there. I believe Nero became ill. He died about 1841, the age of 41. Left his wife Mary with 7 children to raise by herself. All of the notes and recollections from the Vond family are very positive. Mary was a very religious woman. The children were all smart. They were all industrious. Lots of great stories about them, but Walter in particular, he and his brother Elijah bought the land down where Hilton Beach now is, and Walter and Elijah were fishermen. They'd sail their boats out 2 or 3 miles into Lake Ontario when there were plenty of fish out there, set their nets and catch whitefish. And that's how they made their living. They take these whitefish down to Charlotte Harbor, and they sell them to the restaurants in Rochester.
Okay.
But those fugitives coming from the south, heading north directly to the lake, would come down the old Canawagas Trail, and that's the Indian name for 259 that everybody drives on every day. It comes all the way from Canawagas, New York, an old Indian village up just west of Avon, and comes straight down to Lake Ontario. And the Native Americans would use this road to come down to Lake Ontario on the shoreline in the spring and in the fall to hunt and fish. They didn't like it in the summer, too hot, too many mosquitoes, and in the winter, too cold. Later, the early settlers enlarged this trail, and then finally they even made a corduroy road. Now, a corduroy road is a road made of logs, just put horizontally all the way down. The trees were plentiful, and then they'd fill it with gravel so it didn't get muddy and so forth in the spring. Well, at night, one article I read, a lady who lived on Curtis Road, just east of 259 and Curtis Road, in a house that still stands. I'm not sure it's the same house, but her name was Emily Hazen. And in old age, she wrote her memoirs. And she said, well, when I was a little girl, at night, I could hear those wagons rumbling down the corduroy road to the lake. And we all knew what was there. They're under a load of hay. There were probably some fugitive slaves. They're going down to Walter Vond's boathouse. And Walter would row them out to a Canadian ship or take them down to Charlotte, and then they'd sail away to freedom in Canada. Walter Vond's descendants, not his descendants, but his brother's descendants, and I go about the Vond family for quite a while, and I'm going to cut it short, but his descendants came to Hilton 4 or 5 years ago to see the graves in the Dunbar Cemetery. They came all the way from Texas. Very nice people. We had a wonderful time. They were totally impressed, touched that we'd kept those gravestones restored. We'd just restored the cemetery about 5 years before. Lonnie Wilson was the great-great-granddaughter, and she was very emotional when she saw how nicely those stones looked, made all that restoration effort worthwhile. Well, this year we proposed a historical marker to be placed down at the end of Route 259 to honor Walter Vond. It's long overdue, but hopefully it'll be here in June or July. And we're even thinking of possibly making that little postage stamp size grass green just in front of the lake, Walter Vond Park, complete with a bench. Nothing has been established for that, but the sign will definitely go up. And in conversing with the Wilsons, they want to be able to come up for the unveiling all the way from Texas. So it'll be a very enjoyable event when that takes place. Well, I think that pretty well completes my off-the-cuff reminiscences of the Underground Railroad, Mike,
Okay.
unless you have any questions.
I mean, I think the only thing is I'd say is if people were interested in coming to hear you more, how can they get a hold of you? How can they get involved in the Historical Society? I guess I would ask that.
Well, I'm only one person, and the Historical Society's a lot of people. I would say if they'd like to drop in on Wednesday night, we have just sort of a very, how do I call it, a quiet, or not a quiet, but it's a simple open house. We just sit around a table up here and chit chat and ask questions. They're welcome to email me if they've got a specific question they want to ask. I'm not sure I'll be able to answer it, but I'll certainly write back to them and tell them yes or no. And if we find that we've got a real connection, then we'll make an appointment, and they can make a visit to the office, and we can look through some files that might be appropriate to what they're looking for.
Well, very good. So we do have future topics such as Native Americans, the Hilton fire, that's very famous in Hilton folklore. So we will be coming to you for future with those topics and more. But this is our first podcast. But this has been Mike Heiss, Conversations with Crumb, and our Village of Historian, Mr. Dave Crumb. Dave, it's been a joy.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. It's been enjoyable.
The Big H Podcast, tune in now. Conversations that'll wow. Laugh and learn, stay a while. Let's explore that Hilton style. From the highs to the lows, every story just explodes. Mike's got questions on the go, diving deep from head to toe. Every week the guests align, sharing moments so divine. Stay with us, the pace is fine. Every episode you'll find